On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched one of the most consequential military operations in modern history. Operation Epic Fury coordinated airstrikes across Iran, nuclear sites, military facilities, and in the opening hours, the assassination of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei himself. Iran's response was immediate. Missile barrages across the Gulf, attacks on U.S. military bases, and then, the move that changed everything. Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which 25% of the world's seaborne oil and 20% of its liquefied natural gas had been flowing every single day. CNN, the world's energy markets went into shock. Brent crude surged past $120 per barrel. Qatar Energy declared force majeure on all export contracts. Oil production across Kuwait, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE collapsed by over 10 million barrels per day. KPBS. But here's the story that almost nobody is telling correctly. KPBS. But here is the story that almost nobody is telling correctly. This crisis is not primarily about oil prices. It is not primarily about Iran. And it is not even primarily about America. It is about China. About Xi Jinping's 20-year plan to build a new global empire, and how one war in the Middle East is dismantling that plan piece by piece in real time. By the end of this video, you will understand why what is happening in the Strait of Hormuz right now is not just a Middle East crisis. It is the beginning of the end of China's global ambitions as they were designed. To understand why Iran matters so much to China, you need to understand what China has been building for the last 2 decades. In 2013, Xi Jinping announced the Belt and Road Initiative, the most ambitious infrastructure project in human history. Over $1 trillion in investment across 140 countries. Ports, railways, highways, pipelines, digital networks, stretching from China's eastern coast across Central Asia through the Middle East into Africa and all the way to Europe. The stated goal was economic development. The real goal was something far more strategic. China was building an empire. Not the old kind, not colonies with flags and governors. The new kind, an empire of dependency. A web of infrastructure that would make dozens of nations economically reliant on Chinese investment, Chinese technology, and Chinese goodwill for their basic functioning. It was working. By 2025, China had become the largest trading partner of more than 120 countries. Its ports dotted the coastlines of 3 continents. Its railways were threading through Central Asia. Its digital infrastructure was embedded in the telecommunications networks of nations from Kenya to Pakistan. But this entire structure had one critical vulnerability, one Achilles heel that Chinese strategic planners understood and spent years trying to manage. Energy. China imports approximately 73% of its oil. It is the world's largest crude oil importer, consuming over 10 million barrels per day, and the overwhelming majority of that oil flows through one place. In 2024, China received 1/3 of its total oil supply through the Strait of Hormuz, a waterway only 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, sitting between Iran and Oman. CNN, an empire that cannot fuel itself is not an empire. It is a liability waiting to be triggered. Iran was China's insurance policy against that trigger. The 25-year comprehensive strategic partnership signed between China and Iran in 2021 was not just a trade deal. It was China purchasing geopolitical protection for its energy supply. Cheap Iranian oil sold at massive discounts to circumvent U.S. sanctions, flowing directly into Chinese refineries. Iranian territory providing an alternative land corridor for Belt and Road connectivity. Iranian influence across the Middle East providing a counterweight to American pressure on Chinese interests in the region. The entire Western architecture of China's global empire was built on the assumption that Iran would remain a stable, functioning partner. Then Operation Epic Fury happened. The International Energy Agency described the situation created by the Iran war as the greatest global energy security challenge in history. That is not hyperbole. That is a precise description of what closing the Strait of Hormuz actually does to the global economy. KPBS for China specifically. The numbers are staggering. China's bilateral trade with Iran in the first quarter of 2026 stood at just $1.55 billion, down 50% year-on-year. In March 2026 alone, the first month of the war, trade with Iran collapsed by nearly 80% compared to the previous year. KPCW, the cheap Iranian oil pipeline, the discounted energy supply that had been quietly fueling Chinese manufacturing competitiveness for years, effectively shut down overnight. But the damage goes far deeper than the direct China-Iran trade relationship. Chinese investments across the Gulf states. Ports, smart cities, liquefied natural gas terminals, infrastructure projects are now directly exposed to military escalation risk and energy shortages. The ports China spent billions building in the Gulf cannot function if the waters around them are a war zone. The smart city projects in the UAE stalled when Iranian missile strikes hit Gulf infrastructure. The LNG terminal investments became stranded assets when tankers stopped moving. CNN Beijing had also built a railway running through Central Asia into Iran as part of the Belt and Road Initiative, designed specifically to bypass the Strait of Malacca during times of crisis. That railway was damaged by Israeli bombing during the war. YMC, the backup plan, was destroyed alongside the primary plan. And then there is the issue that China's own state media will never report honestly. Although Iranian authorities officially granted Chinese ships passage through the strait, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps blocked Chinese vessels on several occasions, while Beijing did not publicly voice its displeasure. YMC, China's most critical strategic partner, was simultaneously blocking China's own ships. And China, the supposed emerging superpower, could say nothing publicly because it needed Iran more than Iran needed it in that moment. That is not the behavior of an ascending empire. That is the behavior of a dependent. Here is where the fallen empire lens makes this story far more significant than any newspaper analysis is giving it credit for. Every empire in history that built its power on trade route dominance has faced this exact vulnerability, and the ones that failed to secure their critical choke points before they were threatened did not survive. The British Empire understood this with obsessive clarity. The entire strategic logic of British imperial expansion was not about territory for its own sake. It was about choke points: Gibraltar, the Suez Canal, Aden, Singapore, Cape Town. The British Empire built its global power by controlling every critical maritime passage on Earth, ensuring that no rival could threaten British trade routes without directly confronting British military power. When Britain lost control of Suez in 1956, forced out by American pressure after the Suez Crisis, it was not just a diplomatic embarrassment. It was the moment the world understood that the British Empire could no longer protect its own arterial routes. The empire's decline accelerated immediately afterward. China in 2026 faces a structurally identical problem, but in reverse. China never controlled the Strait of Hormuz. It never controlled the Strait of Hormuz. It never controlled the Strait of Malacca. It never controlled the Panama Canal. It built an empire of trade dependency without first securing the waterways that trade depends on. The Iran war and the Hormuz blockade have become the biggest gambit in a broader strategic competition, with the U.S. now moving to contest Chinese influence across every critical waterway simultaneously, from the Panama Canal to the Strait of Malacca. NPR geopolitical experts describe this as rising rivalry spilling into maritime choke points globally, with higher baseline risk, politicized shipping lanes, and more frequent disruptions to commercial flows becoming the new normal. China built its empire assuming the waterways would stay open. America is now demonstrating, systematically and deliberately, that this assumption was wrong. Xi Jinping right now faces a strategic dilemma that has no clean solution. Option 1. Support Iran fully, provide military assistance, break the American blockade, force the strait back open. This risks direct military confrontation with the United States, a war China is not prepared to fight and cannot afford economically while already managing a domestic property crisis, youth unemployment above 20%, and trade war pressure from American tariffs. Option 2. Abandon Iran. Accept American dominance of the strait, reroute energy supply chains at enormous cost, and watch the Belt and Road's Middle Eastern architecture collapse. This signals to every other country in the Belt and Road network that Chinese partnership guarantees mean nothing when American pressure is applied. China's response has been to carefully hedge, defending Iran's control of the Strait of Hormuz diplomatically, while simultaneously courting the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi and quietly accepting that its strategic position in the Middle East has been fundamentally compromised. YMC. This is not strategic sophistication. This is strategic paralysis dressed in diplomatic language. The war has exposed the collapse of core Belt and Road assumptions, proving that security risks genuinely threaten infrastructure, that neutrality is impossible to maintain under pressure, and that investments are exposed to military escalation in ways that Chinese planners systematically underestimated. CNN, an empire built on the assumption of stable trade routes without the military power to protect those routes, is not an empire. It is a very expensive network of vulnerable infrastructure. Iran is not fallen yet. The war continues. The ceasefire is fragile. The strait remains a contested waterway, with thousands of vessels stranded at both ends. But the damage to China's imperial project does not require Iran's complete collapse to be permanent. The damage is already done in the exposed vulnerabilities, the shattered assumptions, and the strategic lesson that every nation watching this crisis is drawing simultaneously. You cannot build a global empire on trade routes you do not control. You cannot project superpower status while your most critical ally blocks your own ships. You cannot replace a 20-year infrastructure strategy in a crisis that is unfolding faster than any alternative can be built. The fallen empires of history did not always collapse in a single dramatic moment. Sometimes they collapsed through the slow, irreversible exposure of the gap between the power they claimed and the power they actually possessed. The Strait of Hormuz in 2026 is that exposure for China. Xi Jinping is watching his 20-year plan crack along fault lines that were always there, but that took one war, one waterway, and one catastrophically miscalculated American military operation to make visible to the entire world. The empire is not yet fallen, but the cracks are showing. And in geopolitics, once the cracks are visible, they never fully close. This is the fallen empire, and history is happening right now.